Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Tom Beckett's private road was suddenly claimed by a power-hungry HOA, he knew this wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated land grab. His gate was torn down, strangers drove through his property, and bogus fines piled up. But if they thought he would back down, they had picked the wrong fight. Tom Beckett had never imagined that his peaceful life in the countryside would be disrupted by a group of bureaucratic zealots who had no claim to his land. For years, he had enjoyed the serenity of his 5-acre property, tucked away just beyond the boundaries of a growing suburban community. His home, a sturdy self-built cabin surrounded by towering pines, was accessible only by a private gravel road that wound through his land. This road had been his lifeline to solitude, a path he maintained at his own expense, leading from the nearest public street to his front door. Everything changed the day he received an official-looking letter from the Maple Hills Homeowners Association. The HOA, which governed the adjacent community, had always been an entity he barely acknowledged. After all, his land was never part of their jurisdiction, yet the letter he now held in his hands made an audacious claim. His private road had been reclassified as a community thoroughfare. Effective immediately, he was to remove his gated entrance, grant full access to Maple Hills residents, and begin paying HOA fees for its upkeep. Tom felt a surge of irritation rising in his chest. Surely this was some kind of clerical error. He had deed records, property surveys, and county registration documents that proved his land was not part of the HOA. Confident that logic would prevail, he decided to handle it the way any reasonable person would, by making a phone call. The next morning, he dialed the number listed on the letter and was greeted by the clipped, self-assured voice of Caroline Smith, the HOA president. From the moment she spoke, Tom sensed trouble. Her tone was firm, dismissive, and laced with condescension as she assured him that the new boundary adjustments had already been approved. She explained, as though speaking to a child, that the HOA had updated its community planning maps, and his road was now considered a shared asset of Maple Hills. His protests were met with cool indifference. "You'll find that our legal counsel has already reviewed this matter, Mr. Beckett," she said, as though the discussion were already settled. "The community requires additional roadways to ease traffic congestion, and your property falls within our new planning zones. It's best if you cooperate." Tom clenched his jaw. "You can't just claim my road. It's private property. I have the original deed, I maintain it myself, and your HOA has zero authority over my land." Caroline let out a small, insufferable chuckle. "We'll see about that." And then she hung up. Still refusing to believe that a group of suburban busybodies could simply declare his land as their own, Tom decided to do something proactive. He drove to the county clerk's office, retrieved official property records, and made extra copies of every document, proving that his road was legally his and his alone. With those in hand, he drafted a formal letter rejecting the HOA's claims and sent it via certified mail. For a few days, things were quiet. Tom thought, perhaps naively, that his firm stance had put an end to the matter. But then came the second wave of intrusion. One morning, he stepped outside with his coffee and froze in disbelief. His gate was gone. Not open, not damaged, completely removed. The metal posts had been sawed clean through, and the remains were dumped in a pile off to the side like discarded scrap. His private property signs were ripped down, their wooden stakes snapped in half and tossed into the weeds. And that wasn't all. As he turned to walk down the now open road, he saw something that made his blood boil. His private road was already in use. A steady stream of cars from the HOA community was cutting through his property, treating it like their personal shortcut. Some drivers waved at him cheerfully, as if this had been the arrangement all along. Tom's hands tightened into fists. This was no misunderstanding. This was an orchestrated takeover. Tom stood at the edge of his now open driveway, watching in growing fury as more and more unfamiliar cars streamed through his property. His private road, the one he had built and maintained himself, had become nothing more than a shortcut for impatient HOA residents who didn't want to take the designated streets. It was infuriating. Determined to put a stop to this, Tom spent the afternoon installing new private property no trespassing signs along the road and placing temporary barricades at the entrance. That evening, he planned to have a locksmith install a new reinforced gate. this time with a security system and surveillance cameras to prevent further trespassing. But the next morning, his efforts were completely undone. As he stepped outside, he found the barricades kicked over and pushed into the ditch. The fresh no trespassing signs were torn down, some thrown into the trees, others smashed in half. His road was once again buzzing with HOA traffic, some cars even speeding through, treating it as if it had always been theirs. And then, as if on cue, Caroline Smith herself pulled up in her sleek black SUV. She stepped out, arms crossed, her expression calmly smug, as if she were about to explain something to a misbehaving child. "Mr. Beckett," she said in her practiced condescending tone, "I heard you tried to obstruct a public roadway. I'm afraid that's not allowed." Tom's patience snapped. "This isn't a public road. You had no right to tear down my gate, no right to tell people they could drive through here, and absolutely no authority over my land." Caroline gave him a slow, almost pitying smile. "That's not what our legal department says. You'll find that the Community Planning Commission has already recognized this road as an essential access point for Maple Hills. The county approved our petition to incorporate it into the HOA's traffic plan." Tom's stomach tightened. "That's bullshit. No one from the county ever contacted me about this." Caroline shrugged. "That's not my concern. What is my concern is that you're now legally obligated to keep this road open for community use. You should also be aware that your property is now subject to HOA maintenance fees, which," she pulled a folder from under her arm and handed it to him with a smirk, "you'll find detailed here." Tom flipped open the folder and scanned the first page. $600 in annual fees for his own road. His grip on the papers tightened. "You're insane if you think I'm paying a single cent." Caroline let out a mocking laugh. "That's up to you. But non-compliance comes with fines, 100 per day, until you're caught up. And trust me, the HOA always gets its due." Tom took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Get off my land, Caroline." Her smirk didn't waver. "Of course, but I'd recommend reconsidering. A lawsuit will cost you more than just giving in." She climbed back into her SUV and drove off, leaving Tom standing there, fists clenched, as another car whizzed by, kicking up a cloud of dust over what was supposed to be his private property. This wasn't just a mistake anymore, it was a coordinated attack. And if the HOA thought he would just roll over and let them take what was his, they were dead wrong. Tom knew that reasoning with the HOA was pointless. Caroline and her cronies weren't just mistaken, they were actively trying to steal his land. If they had already convinced the county to recognize his private road as a community access point, then they were playing dirty. And if they thought he would just roll over and let them win, they had another thing coming. He spent the next few hours documenting everything. He took photos of the damaged barricades, videos of the HOA residents trespassing, and scanned every legal document he had on his property. Then he made the most important call of the day. To his attorney, Mark Davidson, a sharp, no-nonsense property rights lawyer with a reputation for shutting down HOA overreach, Mark didn't mince words. "Tom, this is a classic case of an HOA trying to annex private land through intimidation and bureaucracy. The fact that they got the county involved means they've pulled some strings, but that doesn't mean they're in the right. We need to move fast." "Tell me what I need to do," Tom said. "First, we'll file a cease and desist letter to formally demand they stop using the road immediately. Then, we'll submit an official challenge to the county's decision, showing proof that your property was never part of their jurisdiction. If they refuse, we'll escalate to a civil lawsuit. But in the meantime, you need to make sure they can't keep trampling over your rights." Tom knew exactly what that meant. That same afternoon, he went to a hardware store and bought new heavy-duty steel gates, reinforced concrete posts, and high-resolution security cameras. He wasn't just going to replace the old barrier. He was going to make sure it couldn't be destroyed again. By nightfall, the new gate was installed. This time, it was anchored deep into the ground, impossible to remove without heavy machinery. He placed motion-activated cameras at multiple points along the road, each linked directly to his phone. If anyone tried to trespass again, he'd have clear evidence for the lawsuit. The next morning, the cease and desist letter was delivered to the HOA's legal office. Caroline's reaction was immediate. At noon, she showed up at his property, seething with rage. "Mr. Beckett," she said, barely keeping her voice steady, This kind of hostility is completely unnecessary. The HOA is simply trying to ensure community safety by maintaining access to this road. Tom folded his arms. Community safety? Or just a shortcut for your residents? Caroline's jaw tightened. The county has already recognized this road as a public right-of-way. You're in violation of a municipal directive. Tom smirked and held up his phone, showing the security footage from the night before. A group of HOA members trying to push over the new gate, only to fail miserably. Tell me, Caroline, does community safety include attempting to destroy private property at 2 a.m.? Her expression flickered for the briefest second before she regained her composure. You're making a mistake, Mr. Beckett. We will not back down. Tom's smirk widened. Neither will I. See you in court. The HOA had escalated things to a breaking point, and Tom was done playing defense. This wasn't just about his private road anymore. This was a fight for his property, his rights, and his ability to live without a bunch of power-hungry bureaucrats dictating what he could and couldn't do. And if the HOA wanted war, they were going to get one. Within 2 days of receiving his cease and desist letter, the HOA retaliated with a bogus violation notice claiming that Tom's gate was an unauthorized obstruction of community infrastructure. According to them, he was violating county codes by blocking what they now insisted was a designated emergency access road. They tacked on a $10,000 fine, payable within 30 days. But that was just the start. The next morning, Tom was drinking his coffee on the porch when he heard the unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery. He rushed outside just in time to see a work crew in fluorescent vests unloading equipment at the entrance to his road. His stomach dropped as he spotted the bulldozer parked just past his property line. Caroline was standing beside the foreman, clipboard in hand, looking smug as ever. "Good morning, Mr. Beckett," she called, barely suppressing a smirk. As you've refused to comply with county-mandated regulations, the HOA has taken the liberty of sending in a road maintenance crew to bring your access point up to code. Tom's fists clenched. They were actually trying to pave over his private road, claiming it as public property. "No, the hell you're not." He stormed toward the foreman. "This is private land. You are trespassing." The foreman hesitated, looking between Tom and Caroline. "I was told this road was HOA property." "It's not," Tom growled. "And if you break ground on my land, that's criminal destruction of property." The foreman stepped back, suddenly wary. But Caroline, unfazed, took a step forward. "This is already in progress, Mr. Beckett. The HOA's jurisdiction has been confirmed by the county. If you interfere, you'll be facing legal consequences." Tom smiled coldly and held up his phone. "I've already called the sheriff." For the first time, Caroline's confidence wavered. She turned, spotting the flashing blue lights of a county sheriff's cruiser pulling up. Within moments, 2 uniformed officers stepped out, one of them looking none too pleased. "All right," the sheriff said, eyeing the scene. "Somebody want to explain to me why I got a call about a construction crew trespassing on private property?" Before Tom could speak, Caroline jumped in. "Sheriff, thank you for coming. We're simply conducting routine road improvements. This property falls under our community development plans." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "That's so, because according to county land records, this road belongs to Mr. Beckett." Caroline froze. The work crew went silent. Tom crossed his arms. "So, Sheriff, would you say that illegally attempting to seize private property falls under criminal fraud?" The sheriff grinned. "I'd say that's exactly what it sounds like." Caroline went pale. Caroline had overplayed her hand, and now the battle was heading to the courtroom. Tom's attorney, Mark Davidson, wasted no time filing a lawsuit against the HOA for trespassing, destruction of private property, harassment, and fraudulent attempts to seize land. The sheriff's report from the attempted roadwork only strengthened their case. Caroline had knowingly ordered unauthorized construction on land that didn't belong to the HOA, but the HOA wasn't backing down. Instead, they filed a counter-lawsuit claiming that Tom was illegally restricting community access and that his road had been an established public easement for years. They argued that since residents had used it regularly, it had become public domain by default. Their demand? A court order forcing Tom to permanently open his road to the HOA and pay backdated maintenance fees. Tom sat in the courtroom as the HOA's legal team, led by a slick, expensive-looking attorney, made their argument. They paraded in several HOA residents who claimed they had been using Tom's road for as long as they could remember and that blocking it now was a major inconvenience. Some even went as far as to say that Tom was selfishly harming the community. Mark remained unfazed. When it was their turn, he tore the HOA's case apart. First, he presented the original deed to Tom's land, showing that the road was always private property and had never been designated as an easement. Then, he called the county surveyor to testify, confirming that the HOA's claim of reclassified boundaries was false and that no legal adjustments had ever been made. But the final blow came when Mark revealed evidence of fraud. Using subpoenaed documents, he proved that Caroline had knowingly submitted false paperwork to the county, attempting to alter zoning maps without Tom's consent. Worse, he had obtained emails between Caroline and the HOA board, in which she outright admitted that taking Tom's road was a strategic move to increase HOA property values. When the judge saw this, he was furious. The verdict? A total victory for Tom. The judge ruled that Tom's road was 100% private property and could not be used by the HOA. The HOA had knowingly engaged in fraudulent actions and was ordered to pay $75,000 in damages to Tom. Caroline was personally found liable for submitting false documents and was removed as HOA president. As Tom left the courthouse, HOA members glared at Caroline, realizing she had lied to all of them. The HOA's reign over his land was officially over, but the fallout was just beginning. The courtroom victory was just the beginning. The fallout from the trial sent shockwaves through the entire HOA community, shaking its foundations to the core. The day after the verdict, Caroline was forced to step down as president in disgrace. The HOA board had no choice. Her fraudulent actions had cost them tens of thousands in legal fees, and now they owed Tom $75,000 in damages. Residents, once blindly following her lead, were furious. Many had trusted her claims, believing they had the legal right to use Tom's road. Now, they realized they had been manipulated. In an emergency HOA meeting, angry homeowners demanded answers. Tom, watching from a distance, smirked as he listened to the chaos unfolding in the community center. "This is outrageous. She lied to us. I paid extra fees because of this lawsuit. Where's our money going? She nearly got us all sued. What else has the HOA lied about?" With Caroline gone, the HOA was leaderless, its reputation in ruins. Some board members tried to salvage what they could, but it was too late. The community had lost faith in them. But the real collapse came when residents started refusing to pay their HOA dues. After seeing how easily their leaders had fabricated rules, people started digging into the HOA's finances. What they found was worse than anyone expected: years of mismanaged funds, excessive legal fees, and questionable improvement projects that never seemed to materialize. Within weeks, dozens of homeowners banded together, demanding an independent audit. Some even filed lawsuits of their own, accusing the HOA of misuse of funds. With legal costs mounting and membership falling apart, the HOA faced a financial death spiral. Without enough funds to sustain itself, the board held a final desperate vote, and by an overwhelming majority, the homeowners decided to dissolve the HOA entirely. The same people who had once backed Caroline's scheme were now celebrating its downfall. And Tom. He watched with satisfaction as the HOA signs were removed from the neighborhood entrance, and the HOA's once powerful leadership faded into obscurity. His land was finally his again, with no one left to challenge him. With the HOA officially dissolved, Tom Beckett finally had his land back, completely, undeniably, and permanently. No more letters, no more threats, no more smug visits from Caroline or her goons. His private road was his again. And this time, he made sure there would never be another attempt to steal it. The first thing he did was upgrade his security. He installed reinforced steel gates, this time with electronic keypads and surveillance cameras that recorded every vehicle that approached. A new set of bold, impossible-to-ignore signs lined the road. Private property, no HOA access. The message was clear. This fight was over, and he had won. But the aftermath of the HOA's collapse didn't just affect Tom, it reshaped the entire neighborhood. With no governing body left to enforce pointless rules and demand arbitrary fees, many former HOA residents embraced their newfound freedom. Some began painting their houses whatever color they wanted. Others planted gardens in their front yards, finally free from the oppressive regulations that had dictated every aesthetic choice for years. Some even removed the HOA-installed speed bumps and other community improvements that had done nothing but cause frustration. Yet, not everyone was happy. The homeowners who had relied on the HOA to micromanage the neighborhood now scrambled to figure out what to do. Without an HOA to pay for common area maintenance, they had to organize their own efforts, something that proved far more complicated than they had anticipated. Disputes arose over everything from trash collection to who should maintain the community park. Meanwhile, Caroline had all but vanished. Word spread that she had put her house up for sale and was quietly leaving the neighborhood. No one had seen her in weeks, and frankly, few people cared. To them, she was nothing more than a bad memory. A cautionary tale of power gone unchecked. As for Tom, he enjoyed every second of his well-earned victory. One evening, sitting on his porch with a cold beer in hand, he watched as a HOA-free world unfolded before him. The road in front of his property was empty again, just as it should be. The only people using it were his friends, his guests, and most importantly, himself. For the first time in months, he truly felt at peace. As the dust settled and life returned to normal, Tom Beckett reflected on everything that had happened. What had started as a simple property dispute had turned into a full-scale war, a battle for his rights, his land, and his freedom from a corrupt system. The HOA had tried to steal from him through intimidation, deception, and outright fraud, but in the end, justice had prevailed. The lesson was clear: know your rights, and never let anyone take what's yours. Tom realized just how close he had come to losing control over his own property. If he had ignored the first letter, if he had given in to their fines and threats, he could have easily been another victim of HOA overreach, forced to pay fees for land he already owned and watch as his private road became a public thoroughfare. But he hadn't backed down. He had fought, and because of that, he had not only protected himself, he had exposed the corruption and manipulation that had controlled his neighbors for years. But there was something even more satisfying than winning. He had set a precedent. His case had gained media attention, and soon other property owners across the state were citing his lawsuit as a defense against their own HOA disputes. Mark, his attorney, even mentioned that several communities had started questioning the legitimacy of their HOA rules, wondering just how much power these associations actually had. One afternoon, as Tom was returning from town, he saw a few of his former HOA neighbors gathered near the entrance of their now unregulated community. Some waved, others gave him a polite nod. A few years ago, these same people had blindly supported Caroline's crusade against him, treating him like an outsider, a problem to be dealt with. But now, they respected him. A man approached him, Paul, one of the more reasonable former HOA members. "You know," Paul said, kicking a loose rock on the pavement, "I used to think the HOA was looking out for us, that all those rules and fees actually meant something. But after what happened with Caroline, I've been reading up on how many HOA boards pull the same garbage in other places. It's insane." Tom smirked. "So, what you're saying is, I was right all along." Paul chuckled. Yeah, you were right." He scratched his head. I guess what I mean is, some of us might have been too quick to pick a side. A lot of us just believed whatever we were told." Tom studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "It's in the past. What matters is that we won." Paul nodded. "Yeah, we did." As Paul walked away, Tom took one last glance at the neighborhood behind him. It was no longer controlled by ridiculous rules and power-hungry board members. People were finally free to make their own decisions about their homes. And as for his own land, it was his. Entirely, completely, and forever. Tom turned toward his private road, empty, peaceful, undisturbed. A slow smile crept onto his face as he walked toward his house, knowing that no one, no HOA, no corrupt president, no bureaucrat would ever try to take it from him again, because now they all knew exactly who they were dealing with.